any point in time, just feel free to interrupt me and let me know that you can't hear me. Just give me a sec. I'll just drink some water and then we can start. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. What exactly do we imagine this world to look like? We think this will work in we imagine this to work in a couple of ways. Number one, in pharmacies, we assume that there's going to be separate sections with products that have not yet received regulatory approval. This means that these products are going to be marked distinctly so that individuals understand that these products have not received approval yet. Secondly, we are going to provide information about the extent of research that has been done on these products. So things like in the packaging is going to be labeled, or you can scan a QR code and you will be able to understand how much research has been done. Or we will also ensure that doctors are going to be obligated by virtue of their profession to give you full disclosure about these products, assuming that you ever ask them about the risks, etc., about this. Thirdly, we think that these medications are only going to be allowed access for legally licensed pharmaceuticals. This means that random pharmaceuticals that have not yet received their license, etc., cannot just sell medication for individuals to access. So having established what we imagine this world to look like, I'm going to posit 2 arguments in my speech. Number one, let's talk about why currently, by virtue of the regulatory system, individuals end up not getting medication, and hence hundreds and thousands of people either die or suffer immensely. Why is that so? Because the standards for regulatory approval are very high in 2 levels. The first level is a state level. Recognize that health and the way that you deal with people and healthcare in general is a huge part of the electoral process when people are voting for you, which means healthcare is a huge part of your political mandate. As a result of this, politicians are risk averse when it comes to healthcare policies. That is why they personally put high threshold on regulatory approval, because they don't want to be held liable for damages or condoned for side effects. But this also means then, and this resulted in things like, even though COVID vaccines were technically ready in a few months, states waited a year or longer for regulatory approval to come through, even though people were literally dying on the streets every single day and suffering immensely due to COVID. That is something that they could have stopped, but they didn't, because they did not want to be held liable in case things went wrong. Secondly, doctors. Healthcare professionals are also very risk averse. Why? Because the positive contribution the doctors make, nobody really counts the amount of lives that you save. But one single bad case can potentially ruin your reputation and your career forever. This means then the negative contributions or any accidents that happen as a result of your decision as a medical professional has a huge impact on your career. This is why doctors also support the high threshold for regulatory approval. That is why they will never recommend drugs unless they have a 90 or 95% success rate. So doctors are not going to recommend any other drugs. Thirdly, the nature of the regulatory process itself is something that necessitates time delays and lags. This is due to things of multiple sets of lags due to bureaucratic hassles and time delays, but also due to things like trials taking very long and large amounts of sample sizes that you have to test on, etc. All of this means that currently the standards for regulatory approval are so high that a lot of individuals are not allowed to get access to that medication and end up dying or suffering immensely in the process. What is the conclusion of this? The conclusion here is many sets of products that don't pass the regulatory process because of all of these problems could potentially help out millions of sick people and stop the suffering that they're going through, but they don't end up passing it at all. All right, why do we think that individuals are going to opt in to these products? And here are a couple of reasons. Number one, we think they're likely to do this when there are no other alternatives in place. Why is that so? Firstly, we think that you essentially have an overarching bias towards doctors. You assume that they know best. They have been in the profession for years. You know that their scientific knowledge of medication is a lot more vast than yours. So you will never consume something that your doctor will not specifically recommend to you. Number two, you seek out a lot of information before doing anything to your body, because you are the one who's going to have to live with the consequences of things that you ingest into your body. So you're likely to be very, very careful with regards to medication that you take. But also, you're also likely to do things like seek advice from people that you trust, like your friends and family, etc., who are also going to make sure that they don't give you any advice unless they have researched very well on it. For instance, cancer, etc. They're not going to give you false information because they're emotionally attached to you and you just don't want to put anything in your body, and they want to ensure that you are also healthy. For a lot of diseases that are terminal in particular, oftentimes doctors prescribe palliative care. This means then they tell you there's nothing we can do about it. What we can do is make you comfortable and reduce your pain. Why is this not enough? Because individuals deserve the chance to fight against that disease, even if there's a probabilistic chance of you getting cured and having a chance of you getting rid of the disease. This is a right that you can take. Why is that? Because what is exactly a disease, right? A disease is an attack on your body. This means that you end up suffering as a result of the attack that this disease is positing on you. This means your body is getting attacked and you ought to be able to exert any means that you can in order to defend yourself against this attack that the disease is posing against you. This is why this is an extension of your right to self-defense, because this is an attack on your body and there's no other way for you to defend yourself because the millions of bureaucratic hassles that comes your way. That is why we think individuals have a right to self-defense and a right to defend themselves against diseases in this particular manner, because if there's a chance of them being able to get rid of the disease, they ought to be able to take it. That is the first argument. Secondly, let's talk a little bit about how we allow people access and give them sources to alternative sources to affordable medicine. Number one, we think the problem in current status quo is that people are further stripped of their autonomy because pharmaceutical companies charge exorbitant prices simply because they can. Why? Because recognize that people will opt into the alternative, people will opt into the other medication under our world because the alternative prices are too high. But here's the problem, right? The exclusivity of getting regulatory approval in and of itself is something that allows pharmaceuticals to charge insane amounts of prices because they're the only ones in the market, essentially, because nobody else has been allowed to get that regulatory approval because of the because of the immense amount of procedural deadlocks that I already analyzed. Hence, states only say that X medicine from this very big company like Pfizer is the only company that makes its medication. That's why pharmas can charge high amounts of money and get away with it because nobody else is making that medicine. The first thing this suggests is only the rich can defend themselves, which we think is morally abhorrent. Why? Because health itself is a risk that we think was created and perpetuated by capitalism. Why? Because if you get harder, you get sicker. Hence, working class individuals have a more probabilistic ability of getting sicker. If you don't have a great house or you don't have a car, you inhale more gases that makes you sicker and helps prone to diseases like lung cancer, etc. And you're not allowed to be able to defend yourself against this. All of this means then the narrative that's perpetuated on status quo is that only the rich individuals who can afford these exorbitantly priced medicine are the ones who have a right to defend themselves. We think that's morally abhorrent. We change that. We ought to give individuals, especially the more vulnerable ones, a chance to defend themselves. Negative can say you can subsidize healthcare for the poor, but how many poor individuals can you subsidize? At best, status quo is a medication, but status quo also doesn't work because the incentives of states and doctors still remain, as I analyzed in my first 2 minutes. What can we do? We think that we give these individuals a chance to defend themselves, etc. However, what if people can afford the expensive medication but still want to opt into the cheaper alternative? We think that even that's okay. Why? Because we think that there's no moral value in particular that makes health an a priori value, which means if you don't want to spend that much money on defending yourself but want to save up for things like your children, etc., you have a right to be able to do that. That is why there's no moral value in choosing health over economics, because then all the budget will be located towards healthcare and nothing else. All of this proves then there is a principal right that individuals have to self-defense, and we are the only ones that can give them that right. Incredibly proud to affirm.
We thank the first affirmative speaker for what was a fine speech, inviting on the first negative speaker to begin the negative side of the case. Here.
We would not support a world where supermarkets are allowed to sell food without proper hygiene and nutrition guidelines. We would not support a world where water companies are allowed to pump water to the masses without purity tests being applied to their products. We would not allow for a world where property developers are allowed to allow people to live in buildings without proper safety codes being put in place first. And the reason we don't allow any of those things is because people die when we don't have regulations. People are made sick when we don't have regulations. And in a world where people are desperate, they require medicine, this team would have them pump ivermectin into themselves, would have them put bleach in their veins instead of seeing a doctor, instead of getting the treatment that they require. I'm going to do three things in a speech. Firstly, I'm going to knock out a lot of their material. Secondly, I'm going to talk about treatment on our side of the house. And finally, I'm going to deal with the principle or what exists of it from this affirmative team. Firstly, onto the basic question of this affirmative team's case, because really all of their material relies on you believing that there are good drugs that exist that have not currently passed regulators. And if we allowed people to access them, people would opt into those drugs. And there are just an enormous amount of evidentiary gaps missing in that case, logical leaps, just all over the shop. The first thing to note is that their evidence for why those good drugs exist is the claim that just medical regulators have high burdens, to which we would reply, good. It is very good to make sure that something that millions of people are going to be taking regularly who are already very sick won't hurt them in any significant way, won't cause lifelong side effects. In fact, the process of time they refer to normally comes about because we require people to know whether in 3 years the cancer medication they've taken won't just lead them to developing more cancer, for instance. So in the first instance, we would suggest that the high burdens they're pointing to are a good thing. But the second thing we would point out is that they are not as high as this affirmative team would claim. They're actually reasonable burdens. And in fact, if you look at their electoral incentive material, which is truly the only stuff that they have that has a leg to stand on, it actually works in the inverse, which is to say that if you have a populace who is all dealing with a disease, the pressure on that government is to rush out a solution to it as quickly as possible. And the example of COVID-19 is a good one for us because it was one in which the government had strong electoral pressure to make sure that that COVID vaccine came out in the first instance. But secondly, we would tell you that they point to the power of big pharma and then immediately tell you that regulators are able to just control big pharma. If you believe big pharma is powerful, if you believe that they have lobbying power, you would believe that they would also have the power to be able to rush things through in the first instance, which means that actually the more plausible characterization is one in which the drugs can actually be passed in a relatively fair time zone. But thirdly, we would point out that it's not just a question of whether these drugs are good or bad, but rather whether the drugs being held back are comparatively as good as the other ones that exist on the market. Because even if you believe that there are drugs that could help people, if they're not as good as the ones that people can access, there is still an opportunity cost to people accessing them in the first instance. But finally, we would point out that so many of the bad treatments also flood the market. Because even if you believe there are a handful of good treatments that people might be able to now access, millions of bad treatments can now be accessed, and there is no meaningful way of differentiating between any of them. Importantly, that means that what this team has to defend is not just a world where people can opt into good drugs, but they need to explain to you why they're more likely to opt into those good drugs than all of the bad drugs. And given the fact that the majority of people who take these are normally in the misinformation whirlpool, it's very unlikely they're going to have access to the most up-to-date information about what unregulated drugs are, in fact, the most medically accurate. Secondly, their only other claim is just to suggest to you that we will now have a higher access to alternative drugs, and that's particularly good for the poor. Three responses. Firstly, there's an entirely contingent argument on you believing that people accessing those drugs would be good for them. As we will explain, it would be very bad. We've already explained that mostly. Secondly, they miss the majority of countries in which this debate occurs, in which the government already protects the medical industry by putting on price caps. This debate doesn't entirely occur in nations like the US. It occurs in most of the world where drugs are relatively accessible. But thirdly, they give you no reason to believe that their drugs on their side of the house wouldn't also be very expensive. If you believe that that unregulated drug can save people from a very serious degree, it gives the medical body a lot of power to just raise the price of it in the first instance, which is the reason why drugs are very expensive at the moment. It's not the fake false monopoly that they point to. So that's most of their material out of the debate. What's the debate we're actually having? The debate we're actually having is there are a bunch of drugs that for very legitimate reasons have not been approved for the public, whether that be because it leads to serious injury for that person, serious disease for that person, whether it be because it just doesn't work at all, whether it be because it has serious side effects, whether it be because we have no idea about it yet. And this team would just allow all of those drugs to simultaneously flood the market, to which we would say that is very bad for the reason that people would now engage in those unapproved treatments far more than approved treatments. And the only question you really need to ask is, are approved treatments better than unapproved treatments? And if you buy the characterization of this affirmative team, they're treatments that have already passed incredibly stringent tests. So thereby, you're likely to believe they're very good, unless you also somehow believe that the medical professionals are all phonies. Why do we believe that people would use these unapproved treatments at a much higher rate, given the fact that we've already established that the majority of them are likely to be bad? First reason, in many instances, they're more appealing because we have more information about the negative side effects of existing drugs, which is to say that we know that chemotherapy is going to lead to you losing your hair and losing a lot of energy. But this brand new drug doesn't have any of those side effects because we haven't even monitored them in the first place. Or perhaps you take it through the mouth rather than anally or through intravenously or whatever it might be. For many reasons, these drugs look more appealing and people are likely to opt into them when they can be tricked into believing that they are good for them. Secondly, we would tell you that just by merit of being more accessible in their world, obviously more people are going to opt into them. Thirdly, we would tell you that often when people are at a particular point of crisis, other treatments haven't necessarily worked the way they would expect them to. They're likely to just opt into whatever thing they can believe would be helping them in that moment. Fourthly, we would tell you that there is just a large group of people in the middle who are likely to just dabble in these things from time to time. And fifthly, we would tell you, perhaps most problematically at all, both on the hands of pharmaceutical companies and on the hand of doctors, they have an incentive to engage in malpractice, which is to say, as a doctor, if you know in your region there are a lot of individuals who engage in, for instance, homeopathy, naturopathy, you know that you can corner that market by being the doctor who's a little softer on those sorts of things, will give you the warning, but then supply those things for you. You know that if you get a big kickback from Ivermectin, you'll know that you can prescribe that into the future and get more money from that. And on the behalf of pharmaceutical companies, they now just have an incentive to market these things aggressively to the public. Sure, with a disclaimer at the end, as they point out, this thing has not been regulated or produced by the Australian federal government, but that doesn't matter because the majority of people that they're targeting don't care about that in the first place and have a skepticism of the medical industry. So way more people are going to be using these drugs, both because they're stupid enough to do it, both because they've been tricked into doing it, and because the medical industry has a financial incentive to push them into doing it. Why is that bad? Firstly, it's bad for them because now they don't actually get treatment for their very serious illnesses. Obviously bad. But it's also bad for everyone else for the reason that now, A, that puts a strain on the healthcare system whereby there are more resources tied up on phony treatments for people. And when those people inevitably get sick, that's more resources the healthcare system has to spend on them rather than other people. Secondly, it legitimizes the use of these false cures every time they engage in it, which means it's more likely other people do. Word of mouth goes, oh, I used it and I felt better due to the placebo effect. Now more people engage in it. Thirdly, family and loved ones have to be left behind when these people die because they've taken false treatments. And fourthly, we would tell you in the instance of infectious and spreadable diseases, such as the current pandemic in which we are all experiencing, it's very bad if someone is taking something that doesn't actually stop them from being infectious, given that that directly means more people take it. So on the issue of treatment, this debate is pretty fucking clear. On their side of the house, even if they get some good drugs that now people can access, they need to prove to you how people would know the good ones from the flood of bad ones and why those good ones would be comparatively better than what they'd be taking in our world. Finally, onto the material about the principle that they give us. Essentially, their argument is just that it's good for people to be able to express bodily autonomy. Three responses to this. Firstly, we deny the right to bodily autonomy all the time, as I alluded to in my introduction, when we force people to use regulated products, or for instance, in the instance like seatbelts, or for underage people aren't allowed to do things. We force people to use licenses when they engage in heavy machinery. We force people to use insurance. They can't just say bodily autonomy and have that be an argument. Secondly, we would tell you that this is an irreversible decision, so we ought to protect people's rights. And thirdly, we would tell you the scale of harm justifies us intervening in this instance. But finally, we will tell you there's an active principled harm, because what they are allowing people to do is be tricked and manipulated into taking these drugs, and we as the state ought to step in and protect their rights. We ought to say that you have been swept up into a whirlpool of people tricking you, of people telling you to take bleach into your veins, and the state ought to protect them in that instance because they could not make an informed decision. They could not make a decision that was actually protected by their own conscience, and more importantly, they're making a decision that will kill them. Vote negative.
I thank the first negative speaker for what was a fine speech, inviting on the second affirmative speaker to continue on the affirmative case. You're here.
Can I be heard?
Yep, you're loud and clear.
Fantastic. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Honestly, just a one-liner to summarize the first next speech. People will consume bad things. They will die in the process. We don't want them to die. First response. Let's go through a thought experiment. When the Jewish people were under attack by Hitler, them standing up in defiance to the attack will probably end up in failure anyway. And if you told them that, there's no point in, enraging Hitler more because he's only just going to end up killing more Jewish people in the process, I would find it really abhorrent for you to tell Jewish people that they ought not to fight for their lives. Replace Hitler in this thought experiment with cancer. There is no moral difference to this debate. Their arguments for why people die are logically secondary to their right to self-defense in the face of death. And that is because the status quo is one where if they can't access existing medication, there is no way in which they can fend for themselves or have a meaningful life anyway. And the reason this is important is because there was no defense in the first next speech to prove why regulatory approved drugs are going to be A, accessible, and B, taken in for the vast majority of people all across society, which means the status quo is already one where a vast number of people are under duress. These people are part of the minority. These people are part of the underprivileged. Those who are victims end up working harder and thus creating diseases from themselves, not being able to afford households in order to protect themselves. Those people, if any, deserve a right to defend themselves, even if it hurts others in the process. This is not a right you can strip away from them. The only response to this was, have seatbelts, by the way, guys. Again, you don't have seatbelts in order to defend. It's not like forcing people to wear the seatbelt it's only empowering their right to self-defense, because otherwise they will potentially die. But the point of this argument is to show that there is an existential threat, and the crux of that analysis is not responded to with that only thought experiment. So number one, their entire case is redundant and they lose on the face of it. Number two, let's deal with the even if part of their case. Why will people not consume these terrible drugs to begin with? First, we explained that these drugs are unlikely to be ones that doctors recommend and are unlikely to be ones that society recommends if they are so bad. And that is the point, right? The motion's fiat suggests that all societal narratives are against these drugs, which means there is no overarching reason why you would opt into this drug if you had an alternative. You'd already respect the doctor's wishes. You do look at what others are saying. Number two, let's say some people end up consuming these drugs. We think the market incentive works in a way in which the market fixes itself in the long run anyway, so that the vast majority of people do not consume these drugs. Number one, we don't allow non-registered companies to enter pharmacies to begin with. That means that if a company's drug ends up killing people and hurting people, there is massive potential negative PR spins that these companies do. So they'll only enter the pharmacy at a point in time where it's 50 to 60% effective with limited side effects based on research, and communicate that so that it probabilistically makes sense, and the PR cost is something they don't want to engage in. So the worst kinds of pharmacies are unlikely, or worst kinds of drugs are unlikely to be prevalent in pharmacies to begin with. Number two, these discussions of what happens to one or two particular patients end up devolving all across society. So let's say one of these patients is hurt. That means the doctor knows that a patient has consumed this and has been hurt, that they can convey to the second patient or the third patient. And at some point in time, it gets mitigated. The comparative is maybe 2 or 3 patients suffer, but the alternative is no choice for any patient at all, and all of them perpetually suffer all across. Number three, there are ways in which the societal discussion evolves all across, which means that if society itself is something that wants to protect their own lives, surely the society is not going to devolve into anarchy where everybody's consuming like really bad drugs that hurts everybody. Maybe the backlash on pharmaceutical companies that society itself creates is also going to make sure that the drugs that they have to put into the market are ones that have efficacy. Let's say you don't buy market incentives. The fourth way in which this works is through intercompany incentives. And the reason is because you want to compete in this new space, and that means you allow more companies to enter. What this allows is for big companies that have good drugs to know for a fact that there's a threat from existential competitors to take up parts of their market share or chunks of the profit they currently make. So on a demand and supply equation, they're likely to reduce their price further in order to match the lower market threshold for entry that new competitors are setting. And this is because they know that even if there's not a competitor now, they can enter the market without 4 to 5 years of regulatory delay, or that is a market competitor that is charging at a lower price. All of this puts existential competition on the good drugs. The reason this is important is the best case of negative is having these drugs available to everybody and making sure they don't die. The only world in which these companies have an incentive to do that is when they feel the threat of the market and do not monopolize it. And this is because markets, unlike normal markets like water and the other things that they cite, medical industries operate in niche monopolies. You could have a monopoly in a particular disease because another company doesn't have a 100% effective drug for that yet. And there are multiple sets of monopolies by virtue of multiple sets of diseases. So you can't just have multiple companies operating in the market. You need multiple companies to operate in every disease space for that monopoly to not exist. This is particularly important in order to benefit the people who you want to benefit. Last response. Let's say all of what negative is saying is true. People are so irrational. They really want to save themselves. They'll consume anything anyway. They heard something and they'll opt into it. The first thing I'd like to posit is a vast number of these drugs are available in the black market anyway, especially in countries where regulation is weak, which means that developing countries already have drugs that are in trial, and you might end up consuming those drugs that are in the trial process. Why is this far worse? Number one, you have to access these drugs in channels that are not regulated by the state, which means the ability to make or lacetate them with worse worse material and make them far more perverse for the individual is higher in a world in which the channels through which they're accessed are the black market. Number two, the inelastic demand is one where these companies end up becoming bigger and bigger with no regulatory control, whereas on the side, there's a monopoly of one industry that's being created, which makes it a market that these big companies don't have an incentive to access as well. All of which means maybe with this being regulated, some people consume it less, but those that do consume it in the black market get far more perverse harms. And those are harms that they have to accrue in their world anyway. All of this means, by the way, guys, that we don't make sure that people are harmed. The natural market incentive fixes itself. And of course, we've given you regulations and ways in which this will operate, which makes it a good thing. The last thing I'd like to posit is, even if it harms yourself, like you die in the process, bodily autonomy is something we ought to respect for the most vulnerable. And this is because, by the way, guys, ultimately, when it comes to a decision of life or death, maybe the society tries to control you at a point of time where you're hurting the other third party, right? But the point is that a vast number of diseases don't end up hurting the third party. They're often individualized and they often are just suffering for you. And the vast number of diseases that are uncatered to are rare diseases. So only a 200,000 number of people or 300,000 people all across the world suffer. Recognize that this is moral luck. There was no reason why you chose to have that disease, and there's no reason why you should be part of the minority. The only diseases that states end up catering to are ones that affect the 51%, so they can sell it as an electoral incentive. The vast number of people that are arbitrarily left behind are forced to die. There is no third-party cost of giving them a chance at life, because even if it doesn't save their lives, it gives them choice or autonomy. Choice is what gives life meaning, because you believe that the value you can get for anything is by virtue of the choices that you have in this world. We don't strip people of those choices, even if it means killing themselves. At least they die having a choice that they previously didn't. We need to stop the world from oppressing those who didn't choose to be in the place that they're currently in. Give them that choice back, guys. That's what's most important.
I thank the second affirmative speaker for what was a fine speech, inviting on the second negative speaker to continue on the negative case. Here.
Hey, sorry, just checking that I'm audible.
Yep, you're loud and clear.
Awesome. I'll start from starting in 3, 2, 1. The affirmative team says that choice gives your life meaning. We on the negative say living gives your life meaning. That's what we give people in this debate. 2 questions I'll ask. Firstly, I'll talk about access to bad drugs. And secondly, I'll talk about access to good drugs. Firstly, on access to bad drugs. The first thing I'm going to do here is clarify the kind of drugs that are entering the debate, which would not be sold or prescribed to people otherwise. This affirmative team suggests that this debate is talking about pretty legit semi-tested drugs, which are just a few months away from being approved. That is clearly not the case. If you, for instance, look at the motion, which specifies Ivermectin as an example, clearly this is about lots of drugs that are outside the scope of what regulators are happy with. And note that there is still clearly a financial incentive. You get lots of money in the short term by selling people Ivermectin, and a lot of the people who are selling them that stuff, or a lot of people who put forward drugs that are in fact very dubious and very harmful, are not people who are part of big name pharmaceutical companies. They might be people who are a bit more sus, or smaller pharmaceutical companies who will not suffer immense reputational damage, but even if they do, they get a lot of money, from selling people those like miracle cures, which end up killing them later on or doing great harm to them. That is why clearly the scope of this debate encompasses drugs that are very bad, and those are the harms that we should most care about. So secondly, under this issue, why does this affirmative team mean that people opt into getting treatments which would be incredibly harmful to them? They give us some extremely weak responses. The first claim they make is that people will trust doctors and their expertise. It's true that some people do trust doctors, but the important thing that this affirmative team misses is those are not the people who would opt into getting ivermectin, who opt into the kind of things that we are talking about, because those are the individuals who are captured by misinformation, as we explain at Ollie. And what's really important to understand here is they're captured by misinformation, which is resistant to expertise, which is resistant to scientific information. And that is because it is the kind of manipulation which engenders mistrust for the medical profession. People who are COVID deniers believe not just that doctors are a bit dumb, they believe doctors are literally trying to manipulate people into getting vaccines. No amount of medical expertise counters that, because it is exactly medical expertise of which people are fearful and distrusting. We think there are people who are in echo chambers, people who are COVID deniers, people who believe that the vaccine is going to kill them. Note we explain that medical advice is increasingly politicized, and note that in many other sectors of society, politicization or politicized issues are more important than science. See people who refuse to believe that climate change is true because they politically identify as being conservative. That political identity counters science for many of the people we're talking here. The second thing to explain, though, is as well, people just by virtue of being uneducated don't understand doctors' reasoning or research. They don't understand what we're getting into. And note again, finally, we explain at Ollie that there is a financial incentive on many doctors to exploit this, to put forward medical malpractice, to give people drugs from which they might financially benefit, but which will harm their patients. And importantly, that weaponizes their analysis for trust about doctors, which is to suggest that the group of people who are trusting of doctors are the people who will be harmed by that. The second claim they make more bizarrely is people trust their friends and family, and your friends and family love you, so they'll give you good information. Clearly, that is firstly in tension with their previous piece of analysis, because a lot of the time your family and friends, especially when you're all in the same COVID denying echo chamber, will deny doctors' expertise, which these guys say people trust. But secondly, clearly those people give you bad information a lot of the time. They're not experts, they're likely to be in the same echo chambers. Final claim is that you care about your body. Again, this misses the debate. You might care, but because of the misinformation you describe, you have the wrong ideas of solutions. And the affirmative team here, I think, has an enormous burden to prove. They need to show that this very small exercise of freedom is worth it. And I think this is not an exclusive benefit, right? They say choice matters to people a lot, but note that we would still give people choices between different drugs that are available to you. We also give you the choice to not take medicine. That is clear under the status quo. That's a pretty small perceived loss of choice, not actual loss of choice. You must weigh off against what we give you, which is huge harm to others, huge and irreversible harm to yourself, knowing that we deny bodily autonomy to people all the time on that basis. The only two responses are thusfold. The first thing they say is people would otherwise access these drugs unsafely on the black market. 4 reasons why this argument falls down. Firstly, because accessing drugs on the black market is extremely difficult. It's very hard to buy Ivermectin from shady third-party people. And note that if you buy the second affirmative characterization that we're talking about legitimate, basically approved drugs, why would they ever enter the black market in the first place? That is a tension. And note that on our side, the government's way more able to crack down on Ivermectin sales. In their world, people access them more. But secondly, there's not a big harm, because on our side, people still go to the doctor, because we're not forcing you to take any medicine. We don't force you to get the COVID vaccine. We're just saying you can't also then get my Ivermectin, so there's no harm in seeing your GP. At the very least, you would still access the hospital on our side, even if you like inject bleach into your veins at home. When you feel really sick and like you're about to die from it, you're still going to call for the hospital. You're still going to go there. But the third thing I'd explain is the most radical, least trusting people also don't access the doctor on their side, because they're still deeply distrustful of the medical profession. But the final thing I'd explain, even if none of that is true, the harm of a lot of these drugs is often not dependent on how they are administered, right? If the doctor is injecting bleach into you and you're getting something that will hurt your body, it doesn't matter whether that happens to you in a GP's practice or in your home. The second claim they make here is truly bizarre. They say this is a principle of self-defense. I think you just give people nothing to defend themselves with, right? That that principle falls down because they cannot action it. And this is, I think, the big problem with this case. They never reckon with the idea that sometimes bad medicine is worse than no medicine at all. If you're getting medicine which kills you, which blinds you, which permanently disables you, it is better that you did something else. It is better that you didn't access medicine at all. I'm going to finally look at their last, attempt to win, which is about access to good drugs. Their claims here are crazy. The first one is that regulators deny people medicine because a lot of politicians and doctors are risk averse and the regulatory process is slow. As Ollie explains, this is a good thing. And I'll note that their examples here are all extremely positive. They say doctors are slow to approve drugs because they don't want to kill people, and the regulatory process is slow because we need clinical trials and repetition. They point not to a single malicious incentive. Those are reasons why it is good things are slow. And we also found out there are just countervailing desires for companies and politicians to be the hero, to make money, to respond to demands from the populace. The second claim they make is when you have more drugs on the market, the price goes down. The problem with this is they don't understand the reason the prices of drugs are high is because of patents and intellectual properties, which is what they don't change at all. That's totally symmetric, because if your medicine is protected by a patent, you have some control or total control over the cost. That doesn't change via competition. And it's just totally unclear that the fact that there is, that there are like way more amazing cures which don't get on the market than there are terrible cures which we hold back, that weighing is totally enforceable. The final thing I'm going to talk about then is harms to doctors, which is very important. We say that these guys would force doctors to administer poison to patients, essentially, to contravene the Hippocratic Oath with full knowledge of what they are doing to hurt people in enormous ways. And in a profession which already suffers from a huge degree of trauma, this does unconscionable psychic harm to those doctors who are forced into injecting people with poison, giving treatments that they know are wrong. These guys need to be able to deal with the harm that they do to doctors, not just, as we tell you, the harm they also do to patients. They also do to the people who catch the infectious diseases that those patients do not protect themselves against. We explain that you make bad drugs way more accessible. And even if there is one crazy miracle cure that a regulatory body for some reason has not approved yet or would approve slightly quicker on their side, that cannot outweigh the harm of literally getting people to inject themselves with poison. We are very, very proud to oppose.
Thank the second negative speaker for what is a fine speech, inviting on the third the affirmative whip speaker to wrap up the substantive portion of affirmative case. Here.
Am I audible and visible?
Yep.
Thank you so much. In my speech, first, I'm going to talk about the idea that the medicines are going to be so bad that you're going to flood the market with bad medicines, and essentially this is going to affect people in a negative way. And that's essentially going to cause a lot of harms, because that's essentially what the entire NEC case is predicated on. A few things to notice here, and especially the ones that are nuanced. Number one, with regards to, and this is something that Sajid pointed out as well, but this is quite important with regards to the fact that these are pharmaceuticals that are licensed, and these are pharmaceuticals that have reputational costs. And the fact that they tell you that pharmaceuticals or the medical industry is quite politicized and something that is quite widely spread within news and so on and so forth means that they have a long-term monetary cost if it is such that the medicine is so bad that it's literally going to kill people. Because news spreads quite fast, means that the reputational hit that your company is going to take means that you're going to make less and less money over the year. So it makes no monetary sense to just randomly put out medicine with no effectiveness whatsoever on the market. And number two, this I think is the most crucial, because you see this debate is being explained in a smokescreen where you're led to believe that if someone takes an medicine from the shelf that we are recommending with regards to fever, then you're essentially going to die. But that's not how anything works in the medical industry, right? The toxicity of any medicine is only proportional to the disease itself. What do I mean by this? Cancer drugs can potentially kill you. Chemotherapy can potentially be life-ending, because the risk to reward ratio makes sense in this particular instance, where cancer will also likely to kill you. So a drug that has a high risk is likely to be something that you are likely to take, which means that the vast majority of these diseases will actually cause a death in the counterfactual. What does this mean? This means that these individuals that you're saying, oh, they're going to take this bad drug and then die, they probably would have died anyways because of the terminal disease that they're in. This is something that's regrettable, but this is something that is true, which means The sort of diseases they are likely to talk about, they're talking about essentially are diseases that are already going to kill people. Here's where our nuances come in. In a lot of these cases, these people do not have any access to drugs because of lack of alternatives, lack of money, which means that these shelves are also likely to have fewer costs because of the simple structural reason that it takes money to get regulatory approval and invest that highly in like different experimental stages and so on and so forth. Which means the sort of drugs that they're essentially talking about that are like death causing are also people who do not have alternatives, are also people who need these options the most. Number 3, the things that they're predicating their cases on with regards to like the crowds that are essentially accessing these things without rationality, the crowds that support things like bleach for COVID and so on and so forth, are also crowds who very highly follow things like alternative medicine, homeopathy, and so on and so forth. And here, I think it's important to note that under their world, these crowds are likely to follow alternative medicine and so on and so forth. It's unlikely that they're likely to come into mainstream medication. But if you look at the analysis, this is something that's said in first neg, which is that a doctor is likely to like pander to these crowds by, recommending some experimental drugs so that, they can get into that market. We said that is essentially like a good thing because these people in alternative medicine were not getting any cure to begin with. Under our side, maybe they're getting a cure that has not fully been approved regulatorily, but it's still at an experimental stage. That is still better. Imagine someone taking not taking chemotherapy and going for homeopathical treatment instead of for their cancer means that they will definitely die versus getting an experimental drug that a pharmaceutical company is not 100% sure of, but at least are 50 to 60% certain that it might have some effect on that particular disease. We say on the comparative for that crowd in specific, it makes more sense that we penetrate that market through experimental medicine. If that is true, then that is true in this particular instance. Now the question then the question becomes, what do the role that doctors have to play in this particular instance? They say that doctors may have, there is a bit of a tension in the neck case where they say that, doctors are so good, they have the Hippocratic Oath, would rather not them have to betray that versus, doctors will just try to exploit a monetary incentive and, try to like recommend experimental drugs because they can get things like kickbacks and so on and so forth. First, agree on a characterization. But number 2, we think that for doctors in specific, this industry in specific is so volatile that you do not have an incentive to recommend something that's bad just because you're getting kickbacks, because you're probably going to likely to lose your whole practice, lose your patients and so on and so forth. Oftentimes, if these doctors do not reveal the entire information of that drug to you, then they're more prone to suing. We say that even if the doctor is recommending experimental drugs to you, they will have to, by dint of legal liability, explain to you that, look, these are the 5 things that may happen in this particular instance. To that, the first negative says, but these people are likely to opt for the other drug because they don't know the side effects of that drug versus a drug where like the side effects are well known and so on and so forth. Guys, when it comes to things like medical treatments, the unknown is actually more scary than the known. At least in the known, for a fact that the side effect is likely to be something like weight gain, hair loss, or like even in extreme cases, depression, toxicity coming in your body and so on and so forth. The unknown can literally be death in this particular instance. And the unknown is something that is not known in this particular instance, means that it's less appealing to you. And the doctor is likely to have to illustrate the unknown to you in this particular instance because there is a legal liability to do so, which means the doctors also do not, the doctor's thing does not make sense from their side. Secondly, I think it's important to understand now that we have established that in vast majority of these instances, these are likely to be situations where it's a life and death situation for the patient, and the counterfactual is that they're probably going to die anyways. Why is this very important? Because you need to recognize there are so many people who are affected by orphan diseases that do not have like legitimate treatments at the moment, but more importantly, oftentimes these treatments are flooded by pharmaceutical monopolies and so on and so forth. The reason this becomes very important in this particular instance is when you are trying to determine whether or not you want to bring in a medicine as a pharmaceutical industry for a particular orphan disease, then you do not often have a full calculus of that in your you do not want to invest in this because it's going to take 4 to 5 years to bring a drug in a market that another company is definitely going to monopolize in that particular meantime. However, if your company B and company A has already brought about a fully regulated drug, then maybe in 1 year you can put something on the shelf and compete with this at that particular in that particular market, which makes it worth it even if the population that is affected by this disease is smaller. This happens uniquely under our world, where there are so many people who are affected by diseases that pharmaceutical companies or our society for that matter literally does not care about because there is not enough of them. In those circumstances, things like self-defense, choice, and options become the most important thing because of the simple reason that in the alternative, they're not able to afford this. We have seen the Martin Shkreli case. We have seen so many other instances of rare diseases prices being jacked up. And no matter how many times the next says, oh, the debate is not about the US and so on and so forth. This is also about developing countries where vast majority of the world lives. And these developing countries oftentimes are blocked out of patents coming in from developed countries because of structural reasons. In those circumstances, if developing country pharmaceuticals are able to reverse engineer and put something in the shelf within 6 months, that's likely to be the difference between having a option for someone who is a patient in the developing country, because in developing country, the bureaucratic inefficiency is higher, the time for approval and so on and so forth are higher, having no options because literally all of Africa is shut out of medicine coming in from the USA in a lot of circumstances, versus having no option at all. In those circumstances in specific, imagine what the negative is doing in this particular instance. You are taking away self-defense and the ability to fight that disease for individuals who literally have no other option. They have not proven to you why, on the counterfactual under their side, having no option in a terminal disease is something that is a good thing. They have not proven to you why, in these circumstances, you are probably going to take a very, very bad drug for fever, which probably does not exist to begin with. At the end, it's important to recognize that the context of this debate is unique, and you cannot blanketly playing the brush of this debate by saying things like bad medicines are going to flood the market, and there is a harm in this particular case. Medical debates are way more nuanced, and unfortunately, the negative team does not recognize that. Incredibly proud to affirm.
I thank the third affirmative speaker for what is a fine speech, inviting on the third negative speaker to conclude the substantive portion on negative side.
Hi, could I get a quick sound check?
Yep, you're audible and clear.
Thank you. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. This debate is very unclear, so let's make it clear. The strategy of this affirmative team is to say, sometimes there isn't a regulated cure for a disease, and sometimes our cures, unregulated, unchecked, will be better than nothing. This speech will prove 3 things. Firstly, why the vast majority of the medicine, which these guys allowed to hit the market, will be bad. Secondly, why in the vast majority of cases, the alternative of the regulated medicine exists, is acceptable, is accessible, and is preferable. And thirdly, why on the trade-off, when you give the decision to people and patients, not pharmacies and doctors, because that's what the motion provides, people will make the wrong decision, bringing harm to themselves, bringing harm to the medical system, which now needs to support them, and bring harm to the doctors who have knowingly and willfully and in violation of the Hippocratic Oath been forced to give poison to the people who they're supposed to protect. First, why is the majority of the medicine which these guys bring to the market destructive? I will say 5 things. The first thing is that their mechanism that licensed pharmaceutical companies is enough of a reason to think that these drugs will be safe is patently insufficient. The average reasonable person probably knows of stories where these licensed pharmaceutical companies have done the wrong thing. One that I know is when Bayer gave blood infected with HIV to hospitals in Latin America. And note, the mechanization about why this can happen and how this could be stopped is not provided by the other side. Because they just say, well, you don't want to hurt your reputation. But there's no mechanization about why your reputation is important. And in fact, we would say it's far more plausible that the majority of people who consume drugs don't know much about the companies that they're consuming drugs from. The companies can point to the randomness associated with any medical procedure and the way things can randomly go wrong to lead people to not be informed. And finally, all the material provided to you about political manipulation and leading people down the wrong path willfully applies, explaining why it's insufficient to say licensed companies care about their PR, and that's not, and that'll mean that no drugs, bad drugs, make it to the market. Clearly, many do. But secondly, I would raise a question about how much this side can narrow their margins and narrow the amount that they change the debate or change the world, right? Because this is a debate about controlling the conduct of patients, not controlling the conduct of pharmacies. And that means that this side, as much as they say pharmacies won't allow these drugs to come in, doctors won't allow these drugs to come in, massively shrink their benefit as well in a way where it's unclear that they actually come out ahead, right? Because we explain to you all the ways that doctors have perverse incentives, and I'll deal with their responses about, getting sued later. But there's a meta question about how much this team can run away from the burden and shift and bring additional mechanisms to protect themselves into the debate, which clearly don't operate at the moment. See Ivermectin. Thirdly, we explained to you that there are profits to be made from bad drugs entering the market. And this is something which curiously doesn't get much response, because all they say is, okay, well, if your drug is a bust, then people won't buy it anymore. But the profit has been made. And it's unclear that people know that a drug is a bust. When it's filtered through the lens of Fox News and political manipulation, when people don't follow these things that closely, simply no explanation about why, particularly for the startups that these guys are describing, like the competitors, why the profit isn't enough to drive you to bring bad drugs to the market. Fourthly, even when companies are well-meaning, often the side effects don't emerge immediately, making it very difficult to say that companies, even when they're acting in good faith, which is extremely generous, that they'll be able to constantly be better or smarter than the regulators and only put their good drugs through and not the bad drugs through, when the reason the trials take a while is to look out for side effects. But finally, I want you to remember the one piece of guidance the CA team gave us in terms of this debate. And that piece of guidance was Ivermectin. I would suggest by the end of this speech, even if the only bad drug we claim is Ivermectin, that harm is enough, because it's hundreds or thousands or millions of people killing themselves or disabling themselves or blinding themselves based off false information. So what you know so far is that plenty of bad medicine is going to make it to the market. Secondly, by contrast, why under our side of the house is there a reasonable cure for the majority of ills, right? Because their main line in this debate and the main way they run away from how bad their cures are is, well, there are problems with the regulated cures. So I'm going to deal with price, then I'll deal with time. Firstly, why do they not fix the price issues, or why do price issues not exist under our side if they are able to overcome the price problem? Well, the first thing which doesn't get response is we explained to you with Sophie that often the price issue with drugs doesn't come from companies not having competition, but not having competition specifically on the products they've developed because they've patented it. And no amount of finagling with the way that patients are allowed to pick their own treatments or changing the trialing process will change that. You still have an IP domination over that particular cure. What this means is that the only new cures which these guys get are entirely new ideas, entirely new ways of curing a disease. And in that context, we would suggest the natural incentive is for a company to profit, subject to new cure bias, which leads people to be willing to pay a higher price. The fact that the demand is inelastic, as they suggest. These are all reasons to think that even if there are new cures, and some of those new cures make it to the market, those cures won't be meaningfully cheaper. But note, even if you don't buy our analysis and think that just simply having more drugs on the market, good or bad, means more competition and lower prices, this only works. That mechanism only works if lots of people are turning their backs on the traditional cure to go to the competitor, because that's the only thing that puts pressure on the price. And in that circumstance, and with the characterization we provided you down the bench about why a huge number of these cures are destructive, it's incredibly hard to buy this as a benefit. But secondly, I'll explain to you why the wait is not too long. And this is just an act of balancing. They say doctors and regulators are risk averse, and we say sometimes doctors and regulators want to be a hero and they're subject to a lot of public pressure. No, we don't want to win this argument. We don't have to, because this is what we want. We want a balance. And there's been no explanation from this team about why that wait is too long, right? Because they kind of brush over what happens when the wait is long, but for a good reason, right? They brush over the fact that for lots of times when these drugs, which appear effective but make it to the market, have side effects. They brush over all the times when people are essentially injecting themselves with poison, even when companies have tried to do tests and are far down the testing line because they've skipped the last steps. And those steps are crucial. So what do we know so far? We know two things. We firstly know that in many of the cases, a huge amount of the medicine these guys support will be destructive. And secondly, by and large, there is enough medicine at a reasonably accessible price at a good amount of time under our side of the house in order for us to win the debate. So now let's talk about the lens through which all of this must be viewed. And it's the way that people make decisions, because this is their last chance to get away from people basically poisoning themselves. They say people care about their bodies, people trust their families and doctors, so people will be careful to make the right decision. But note precisely what that proves, because it doesn't prove that people will make the right decision. It proves that they might want to make the right decision, and it proves that they will have a mixture of right and wrong information from their doctors, their families, and their community. What do we provide to you? We provide you the reasons which directly counter this push. We explain to you that snake oil sellers have much to gain by marketing and capturing doctors. We explain to you that people can't deal with huge amounts of scientific information, particularly in the context of manipulation. And note, Third Affirmative tries to say, well, these super manipulated people wouldn't go to the doctor anyway, but note just how many people this team is asserting don't go to the doctor. all the people that watch Fox News, all the people that listen to Joe Rogan, all the people who listen to all the crazy radio stations in Australia, and I'm sure in their country as well. And it is just implausible that these people, that there isn't a group of people that is being manipulated but might go to the doctor. And finally, even if you buy the material about the developing world, well, that's another reason to think in a circumstance where scientific literacy is particularly low, harms arise. Their last ditch attempt is doctors really don't want to be sued. 1, it's hard to push liability on doctors. 2, people don't want to sue. They don't know how to sue. They don't have the money to sue. 3, even when people sue, the doctor will likely win. And I think even if you didn't buy the first 6 minutes of my speech, this issue alone is sufficient for us to win the debate. Because if we prove to you people are not making good decisions in the context of all this information, it doesn't matter whether you buy their analogy to Nazism. It doesn't matter whether you think that there is a principle of self-defense, because people are not actioning a principle of self-defense. They are walking into a trap. Pharmaceutical companies know it, and the affirmative team would allow it to happen. Vote negative.
Thank the third negative speaker for what was a fine speech, inviting on the negative reply speaker to conclude the negative side of the case. Yeah, here.
I should probably get my papers out. Just briefly before I begin my speech, I just want to say what a joy it's been to debate BRAC. We love you guys. Cool. I want to step through the various ways that this negative affirmative team attempts to win the debate. The first way that we hear from first and second is to insist to you that people have a right to self-defense. How do we respond and how do we overcome this argument? The first way we overcome this argument is with the simple observation down the bench that in the vast majority of instances, what people are performing is not self-defense, but self-destruction. And they would have to explain to you why it is the case that the vast majority of individuals who are opting into these unapproved drugs are doing things that are good for them in order for this argument to carry any weight. In order for it to work as an analogy when we're talking about the Jews facing down Auschwitz, in order for that to carry any rhetorical swing, they would need to demonstrate to you that people are mostly helping themselves. But secondly, we tell you that in the instance where there is the ambiguity, where some people help themselves, where some people harm themselves, the state errs on the side of protecting these individuals, both because they have not made properly informed decisions, because they have been likely manipulated by pharmaceutical companies, because they have likely been manipulated by doctors, because they are stuck in ecosystems that lie to them, that tell them what they are doing is good, but what they are doing is poisoning themselves. And we, the state, would protect them from that. But additionally, because what they are doing hurts other people, because by harming themselves, they strip money away from the medical system that could be saving other lives. They hurt their family and friends who have to be left behind with the funeral, and they hurt the doctors who have to, against all good wishes, against all best intentions, kill that person in the name of their own self-defense. So on the issue of self-defense, we explain to you, this is something that we would strip from people because they are not defending themselves. The next way they attempt to win at third is by explaining to you a comparative that simply does not exist in the debate. They attempt to try and convince you that there is a large set of people for whom there is no alternative cure. All they have available to them is just withering away, and now we at least give them something. Irrespective of the fact if it is 50% effective, at least they have something. The first observation we would make, they have not explained to you in any meaningful way why that situation would take up the majority of the comparative in this debate. We explained to you down the bench why people who have other alternatives would likely opt into these, whether they are misinformed, whether they are averse to the other side effects, whether they are being literally misled by their doctor at the time, which would explain to you why the comparative they point to is not the most common and therefore not the most important. Secondly, we explain to you that even in the instance that you buy that this is the comparative of the debate, all our analysis about the potential harm that happens to that person still applies. Because even if they now have a 50% chance of getting better, they still have a 50% chance of getting much worse. They still have a chance of withering through all of those side effects. And that is something that we would not force that person to go through. We would not allow them to choose to go through that. But thirdly, and finally, we suggest to you that even if you believe that group of people are important, everyone else is more important. That person who has a flu and goes to the doctor and ends up sending themselves to the ER. That person who has cancer, and instead of taking the treatment that would save their life, they instead take something that does nothing and allows them to die slowly. We explain to you that all those other people are significantly more important in this debate. But the final way this affirmative team attempts to win the debate is simply by suggesting to you, basically asserting to you that these bad drugs that we speak of just don't exist. They just don't exist. Pharmaceutical companies are too concerned about their PRs. Doctor would never recommend those drugs, and they never produced in the first place. Despite the fact that A, the info slide literally points to an example of a drug that kills people if they were to take them, a bad drug. Despite the fact that B, we talk about the perverse financial incentive for both pharmaceutical companies and doctors themselves to recommend people these drugs, particularly in the circumstance that this affirmative team talks about, where there are no viable regulated alternatives, particularly in the circumstance where people are desperate and you can sell them that snake oil. But finally, we explain to you all of the reasons why in the vast majority of instances there are cures. Because if you believe this affirmative team, and most of the time we're talking about people going to the pharmacy to cure the common cold, there are things they can take. They can take strepsils, they can take things to stop their blocked nose, but this team would let the person who is misinformed more easily access the thing that is likely to hurt them. On all fronts, this debate is about stopping people from making the bad decision, stopping corporations from manipulating people, stopping people from dying. Very proud to negate.
I thank the negative reply speaker for what is a fine speech, inviting on the affirmative reply speaker to conclude the debate. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yep, you're loud and clear.
Oh, fantastic. As always, pleasure debating against Sydney 1. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I'd like to posit is an explanation of why these drugs are, in probabilistic sense, going to have a vast majority of their portion to be good drugs. We give you two things that were unresponded to. Number one, states and doctors and the nature through which they're risk averse. This is because they don't weigh on a probabilistic scale of whether this drug will be good for a vast number of people. But the fact that even one bad case and 900 good cases is still bad enough for them to lose PR in electoral cycles and also reputation as doctors in the market. That's why the premise of what enters the market and what is recommended is not necessarily what is good for the vast number of people, but what is universally accepted. That is why from the first half, we've proven to you that there's a lot of drugs that don't pass the test to enter the market or be prevalent in the market by virtue of the incentives of these actors. They conceded to this, they never challenged it. So that in effect concedes that a lot of these drugs could be useful. Number two, we explain context, where if the definition of these drugs being bad is the fact that they will harm these groups of people. By virtue, that also means their bodies are weak and are prone to diseases and death, which also makes them more terminally ill in the process. So the worse, by their definition, these drugs are, the more probabilistically they're likely to die anyway. At that point in time, even from first half, we proved that there is no moral value that you can ascribe palliative care and extending your life beyond taking a chance to save yourself. There was no further response to this, even though their only response was an assertion that, living longer is a priori good. We do that to people, whereas there's no response to the sophisticated analysis of why that is not a choice for you to make, but for the people to make at that point in time. That is why a vast number of these drugs are likely to be good. We took the most charitable characterization of this debate, which is maybe there are some bad drugs in the process, but a lot of these people will be served. The second thing then we told you is, what is the most important part of this debate? It is having a choice rather than having a good choice made. Why is this the case? This is because for a vast number of these individuals who are not currently suffering treatment or getting treatment, they just are stripped of their humanity and their choice, and there is imminent death they face. Firstly, because there's no choice in what kind of disease they choose. The moral luck of being part of a minority where you can't get the state services or the state welfare or the diseases. Number two, the fact that you can't afford particular drugs or you want to prioritize other factors, like you need to save money for your children's education in the future, even if you die. All of these choices are choices that you were stripped off of. The point I'm trying to make is, even if you end up hurting yourself in the process by virtue of a probabilistic chance of that one option, that is an imminent reality that is based on time anyway. But now we empower a vast number of people to make that meaningful choice that could benefit themselves. This not only is important for utile reasons, but the choice in and of itself is the utile outcome, even if it doesn't help them, because they were stripped of choice. So we return that choice back to them. This is not dependent on getting better because the right to self-defense is immaterial to the utile outcome of that self-defense. That's one way in which we win. The second way in which we win is the way in which these people make decisions. We explain that they're likely to make good decisions and access the right drugs. And that is because we first explain an overarching bias to these particular actors who don't recommend these drugs. There was no further response as to why that changes. Number two, we explained how the market and its incentives work, why companies won't want to, send drugs that hurt their own PR and lose revenue in the long term. Again, no response. The third thing we explained was how the consumer base eventually maximizes itself. So yes, some people get hurt in the process, but at some point in time, you know what the impacts of these drugs are, and you have discussions in the market that equalize demand and supply. The alternative is no drugs and no access and people dying, all of them suffering at the same time. The last thing we did is, even if these are groups of anti-vaxxers, it is unclear why they're the biggest portion in this debate, because diseases are more prevalent than that, but also mitigate that by saying we enter that market and help them get incremental treatment in other ways by catering to some values they ascribe to. There was no way in which the status quo benefits anti-vaxxers because all their harms are symmetric in their side. There's no way they win the debate. I love you guys, but unfortunately, you're going out of the tournament.
I thank the affirmative reply speaker for what was a fine speech and all the debaters for what was a pretty great and highly entertaining debate. Good luck to both the teams for the results.